Good morning, everybody. I'm Laura Logan. I'm a correspondent for 60 Minutes, and we're here today to talk about how we do fight back in this war. And as all of you know, for the U.S., 9/11 was really the beginning of the war on terror, but with the attacks in California and San Bernardino, that war has entered a new chapter, a very frightening chapter for everybody here, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, what you can do, what the average person can do, what this threat means right here in Texas, not just across the world. And I'm going to introduce you now to the panel. There's something very exciting about having a conversation like this with a room full of very smart and very beautiful women. And I feel very fortunate to be here. I want to introduce you first to Emma Skye, who I have known for many, many years from her time in Iraq, where she spent 3 years as an advisor to General Raymond Odierno, who was then the commanding general of U.S. forces in Iraq, and is a great man. I know Emma would agree with that. Emma is also the author of a book that many of you here would probably be very interested to read. It's called The Unraveling: High Hopes and Missed Opportunities in Iraq. And Emma is now at Yale, where she is teaching Middle East politics, if any of you have daughters or nieces who are thinking about what to study. Next to Emma, we have Farah Pandith, who was the first ever special representative to Muslim communities and served under both Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton and Secretary John Kerry, but she also served in both Bush administrations. She has a long history in government and politics, and she now works in the private sector at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, driving the effort against extremism worldwide. And Farah is particularly qualified to speak to you about what every single one of us can do to counter this threat. Juliet Kayyem, next to her on the end there, served as Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. She has also written a book called Security Mom: An Unclassified Guide to Protecting Our Homeland and Your Home. So we have a panel of underachievers here today who know nothing about this subject. I'm going to begin with Juliet. I want to ask you, in the wake of this attack in California, which is perhaps a little more frightening because it happened in a tiny little town, and it's a couple, and it's a woman, and by all accounts, this is the first time, a female terrorist operative has carried out an attack on American soil. And not only that, but this couple had a 6-month-old baby. Okay, every mother in this room, I mean, you had to have the same feeling as me when you heard that. How do you imagine that you and your husband leave the house knowing you're going to orphan your child? Right? So can you talk to us about how vulnerable we are here in the U.S. And what can people here do to counter this threat?
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Tina Brown and my friends on the panel. I wish one day we weren't all meeting up, but unfortunately the last couple months have been very scary for people. So, I'm going to be very blunt here. We're never going to get the risk to zero, and we delude ourselves to think in this country, as diverse and open and about the flow of people and goods and ideas that make it such a vibrant country, that we've ever lived in a time of zero risk. So really a way to think about the threat we're having and how to fight it is, I always think in threes, I have 3 kids, is we minimize the risk, which is what President Obama talked about in terms of Syria, bombings in Syria, controls on certain immigration flows, things like that. We protect various places that might be at risk, our schools. So I'm sure a lot of you had schools that sort of ramped up security in the last couple of weeks, sporting events, concert halls. And then we brace ourselves. And this is the part I think we don't nurture in this country. We prepare ourselves. And so part of, the Security Mom book I have coming out in April is really, people like us have spent a lot of time at this level, but not bringing it down to earth. So, one thing is we can worry about the threat all the time, and we can wonder, how does someone like that get radicalized? I don't think we're going to ever get that to zero. And so in some ways, our focus really should be on, have you talked to your kids age appropriately? Do you have a plan if cell service goes down? Do you have copies of vital documents and information in your own family? Are they mailed out of state? I mean, the basic things that give you grip, because I can't answer the question of how a mother leaves her child and goes and kills people with her husband. I can't, and I'm not sure we will ever.
Well, there is an answer to that, right? Because she did it. And
Yeah.
it speaks to training, it speaks to commitment, it speaks to ideology. So, Farah, can you talk a little bit about that? The ideology is something that you are very much focused on. Islamic State, in 1 month, puts out more than 1,000 messages on social media. And really, not enough is being done to counter that. They are the dominant voice in the social media sphere, but they are not the dominant voice in the world. So where is the voice of the rest of the world?
So thanks for asking, and I also want to thank you all for being here this morning, and to Tina for this opportunity. This is a very sobering way to begin your day. I am aware of that, and in the context of a presidential election where you're hearing all kinds of things, and in the days after the president's speech, I mean, it's on everybody's mind. How do we think about ISIS? Here's the really bad news. ISIS is not the worst of your problems, by the way. It's what you're seeing right now. When we look at the threat we're facing, we're looking at an ideology that has been building in different forms all around the world. This isn't about the Middle East. This is not about Africa and al-Shabaab. This is not about the Taliban in Afghanistan or any other group you happen to know. This is about an us versus them narrative that various extremist groups have taken to themselves and have begun to recruit in a wide range of ways. Now, you talk about the tactic of putting out tweets. That's a tactic to get there, to bring people in, to lure people in online. But what's happening in the on and offline space is what you need to be thinking about every day. Why? 1.6 billion Muslims live on our planet. That's 1/4 of humanity. And 62% of that number are under the age of 30. That is the pool from which the bad guys recruit. That's why it's serious. That's why we need to think about it. So when you hear people talking about defeating ISIS, I promise you, mostly you're hearing about a hard war strategy. The hard power. How many troops do we need to put into this? How many drones? Hard power is very important. You cannot defeat terrorist organizations without hard power. But we have done nothing to compete in the soft power space and diminish the appeal for those recruits, those who are susceptible. I've traveled all over the world, as you well know, more than 80 countries around the world as special representative, and have talked to tens of thousands of millennial Muslims. And something very profound is happening to that demographic. In the context of a post-9/11 world, they are seeing the world with a very different experience than their parents and their grandparents had, because they've seen the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers on and offline. They're suffering from what I would call an identity crisis. And I'm not trying to be cute about this, but if you don't know who you are, and if you're asking questions about how to be modern and Muslim and how to be a real Muslim, and the loudest answers that are out there are those from the extremists, that is the direction you're being pulled. So to your question, how do you flood the marketplace with the counter narratives to prevent our kids from getting radicalized? You outpace and fight this at scale with counter narratives by credible voices that make sense to peers. How many people in this room are parents? Okay, most of the room. Do your kids listen to what you say, or do they listen to their peers? We've got to get the kinds of voices that make sense for the peer groups to be able to influence them. And that's not the guy with the longest beard and the highest hat. That's something that makes sense for governments, when we can check off the list of here are the countries that said this, here are the theologians that said that. What we have to do is to ramp up the counter movement of peer-friendly counter voices, and you do that by doing this at scale with the kind of money that we need in the on and offline forums, and we need to understand what our ecosystem is all about when we think about these young people. This isn't just about the Muslims. This is about all of us. our kids who are being pulled in a direction. And when you begin to see it like that, you begin to realize that sourcing the solutions isn't from government. It's from civil society. And what I know firsthand is that no government on earth, Muslim majority countries or countries in which Muslims live as a minority, have the credibility to be able to go after this. It is going to take civil society to bring a lot of different answers to the table so that you are changing the ecosystem, you're developing a way for a young kid who is dealing with an identity crisis to be able to hear the counter-narratives. And here's the kicker. We have yet to look at the mental health capacity in our country and around the world to help and connect what's happening in their mind space with what's happening on their smartphones.
So I want to come back to that theme that you raised about all the, the huge Muslim population on the planet and what that means in terms of this fight. But before we do that, I just would like to ask Emma, it's hard for most of us to follow. Who are these people? We're told they are Al-Qaeda, they're not Al-Qaeda. The president himself said in his latest address on Sunday evening that we were fighting these people on the ground in Iraq. And that's exactly right. Many of the people in the Islamic State today were part of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, were fighting US forces before. And Emma is perhaps uniquely qualified to help give you some sense of perspective on how we got to where we are today. There's a lot of blame thrown around, and the blame in one respect doesn't really matter. It's how do you make sense of who these people are, who this organization is, and what they want. And Emma, can you speak to that a little bit clearer?
That's a really easy one, thank you.
She told me to go easy on her. Before we came on stage, she said, I remember what you were like.
Yes, this is the first time I've actually seen Laura outside of Iraq. And she always used to turn up to interview the generals. And she would sit there looking so sweet and lovely. And they'd be smiling back at her, and then the questions would come. It's like, ow. Good to see you, Laura. So the president in his speech on Sunday said, we've been fighting these Islamist extremists since 9/11. And that is true. But you can also see that the numbers of terrorists have proliferated. And you really have to ask yourself why, because part of that is an unintended consequence of US policies. We should never have gone to war in Iraq in 2003. But nothing that happened in Iraq after 2003 was inevitable. There were different paths that Iraq could have gone down. But when we went in, through de-Baathification and dissolving the Iraqi military, we collapsed the state. And that basically led to civil war in Iraq. The power vacuum, people scared, led to civil war. And that created the chaos in which a group like Al-Qaeda in Iraq could gain traction. It was the chaos of a failed state. Now, in Iraq from 2007 to 2009, we watched a real change take place in society. So that period was during the surge. We brought in extra forces. The main thing that happened in that time was the Sunni population of Iraq turned against Al-Qaeda with our support. And that basically brought down the violence. It led to the Shia militias dissolving themselves. It led to the development of inclusive politics in Iraq. And when there were inclusive politics in Iraq, the Sunnis of Iraq were willing to contain and defeat Al-Qaeda. And so only from 2007 to 2009 did we actually have the right strategy, leadership, and resources in Iraq. So how did ISIS emerge? And I think the resurrection, if you like, of ISIS in Iraq goes back to 2010. In 2010, it looked like Al-Qaeda was defeated. It looked like Iraq was really on the right path. And Iraqis believed in politics. They turned out in great numbers to vote in the 2010 national elections. And much to everybody's surprise, a bloc called Iraqia, which campaigned on a platform of no to sectarianism, Iraq for all Iraqis, went on to win the most seats. Because that platform appealed to secular Shia, to Iraq Sunnis, and to minorities. But the incumbent, Nouri al-Maliki, absolutely refused to accept the results. He just said, I'm prime minister and I'm staying. And he tried to change the election results, and that failed. He wasn't moving. And there was a big dispute within the US system over what to do. My boss, the general, thought we should uphold the election results and let the winning bloc have first go at trying to form the government. But in the end, Vice President Biden said, look, Maliki's an Iraqi nationalist. Maliki's the only guy really who can run Iraq, and he's a friend of the US, and he'll give us a follow-on security agreement. A bit of an assumption, a wrong assumption, but that's what the decision was taken.
Especially since Nouri al-Maliki was backed by Iran. He was Iran's boy in Iraq.
This is what happened. So Iran was able to broker the government using the Sadrists and putting together a very anti-American government on the condition that all US troops would be forced out by the end of 2011. And Maliki, in his second term, accused Sunni politicians of terrorism. He did mass arrests of Sunnis. He reneged on his promises to those tribal leaders who'd fought against al-Qaeda. And all this led to Sunni protests, which were then crushed violently. And this provided the environment in which ISIS could rise its head.
And where was the US in the midst of that?
Running for the exit.
Mm-hmm.
So as the hard power was withdrawn, so was the soft power. Nobody was helping mediate and negotiate or pushing back on Maliki for these policies. And we saw the awakening leaders, the Sunni politicians had been pushed out of the process. We saw the awakening leaders being assassinated or detained or fleeing the country.
And these are the people we're asking to rise up again now and fight against ISIS. And believe us when we say this time, we know. Sorry we withdrew and left you alone last time. We won't do it again, I promise.
There is a sense, among them that they were abandoned because they only rose up the first time because we were there to support them, and they saw us as a buffer and helping them push back on Iranian influence. Today, the US has withdrawn, and Iran is very, very prominent inside Iraq. But also, in those years while we were withdrawing, Maliki replaced the Iraqi commanders who were competent, but who we regarded as close to the US. He replaced them with his own lackeys. And so when ISIS came into Mosul in June 2014, Iraqi army didn't fight. Those new commanders had taken the money that was supposed to buy ammunition and food for the troops, taken it, pocketed it for themselves. They never gave orders to the Iraqi army to fight, and the whole Iraqi army collapsed.
So I want to pose this question to the whole panel. It's something that is underreported, is not often talked about, and I think each of you has something to contribute to it. The vast majority of people killed every single day by the Islamic State are not Christians. They're not Americans. They're not Yazidis. They are Muslims. Something like 90% of the victims of these terrorist groups are Muslim. So this whole idea that this is a war, between Islam and Christianity, it's a war between the Muslim world and the Western world or America, or we're responsible for this because we invaded Iraq, we're responsible for this because of colonial policies. That's one part of it. But really, why does nobody stand up and say, this is not a religious organization, this is a political movement that seeks power, it seeks world domination, and the number one victim on an hourly basis are innocent Muslim people all over the world.
Right.
And why do Muslim countries not rise up in the same way that Western countries are rising up to fight? They should be leading the fight just based on that fact alone, because it's not just Washington where they're coming. They're going to Riyadh, they're going to Damascus, right? They're going to Beirut, they're going everywhere.
It's a great question, and part of it is the counter-narrative that Farah's been so part of. That is clearly part of the counter-narrative, is this is Muslims killing Muslims, and we need to get those voices out there. But I am going to say something and throw myself into what's going on in the United States. I have been in counterterrorism and homeland security before 9/11. There weren't many people. It was considered a fringe field in national security. If you asked me, what keeps America safe? I'm not delusional. I know, people die. I know we've had attacks. I know we are under threat. But overall, what keeps America a relatively safe nation? All of us have traveled the world. We are relatively safe. And the one answer anyone in my field will say is, because you assimilate so well. Because we have the capacity to bring in all these different voices, Lebanese Christian family, Muslim families, Hispanic, Mexican immigrants, whoever, and we make them American, right? And that is part of what makes us safe, because everyone, for the most part, is committed to our security. So when we behave in ways that make that American fabric seem not the way forward, some of the stuff that you're hearing in the news today, I want you to think about that not only as political, but to think about it in terms of this narrative, in terms of this security narrative. I have no doubt that some of the things that are being said now are going to be on ISIS recruitment videos in a week, because we fall into this idea that it's Christians versus Muslims. It's not. And so I will let the politicians figure out who's going to be the next president, but I honestly believe that this dialogue going on now is not only wrong, because I think it is, but it is actually making us more unsafe. And so we've got to get the right narrative out there and not behave in a way that sort of plays into the narrative that ISIS wants their adherents to believe.
Farah, what's your feeling on that?
So obviously, I agree with everything Juliette said, and I will go one step a little bit deeper in terms of the granularity of why. Why haven't you heard these voices? I don't mean to be boring, but I will just say to you, people are calling on people to do things, and then I ask them, well, how do you expect them to do it? Do you want them to stand on a soapbox in the middle of the town hall and say, I don't believe in this? Do you want them to do a tweet? What do you want them to do? You want to start a movement. How do you start a movement? You need leaders in that movement. You need money behind the machine that is outside of government. You need the organizations that are doing things every single day and have been since 9/11, trying to push forward at a local level those counter narratives. Those grassroots organizations have no funding. They have no infrastructure. People are calling on them to do work, and they are in these tiny little voices, little pebbles on a beach. It has to be moved. As you said, where's the movement to rise up? There is definitely a role for state actors to play, and how they do things in international forums, how they stand up. But my bet isn't on the Muslim majority countries who have to go out there and say one. My bet's on people like you. My bet is on regular individuals that live in this planet who believe that we can defeat the extremist ideology. I'm writing a book about that. I believe in it. I could not have woken up every single day for 11 years serving my nation if I believed that we were going to be defeated. We are not going to be defeated. Not just here in America, but around the world. And so what I would say to the philanthropists, to those out there who say, what can I do? Find local organizations and start moving them. Start giving them what they need so that they can blast things out. I will tell you something that's really embarrassing. When you start to make a list of the kinds of grassroots efforts globally who are doing things, it's on, the ones that you've heard of are on one hand. But all the tinier ones, the ones that are in South Africa and Uganda, whether they're in Afghanistan or they're in Norway, they need help. They need help from regular citizens. And so I like you, do understand intellectually this is more Muslims have been killed. It's very painful for Muslims to watch what's going on, to hear. All agreed. But if we're going to fight and decrease the capacity for extremist groups to have the microphone, we have to blast the marketplace and outpace them at scale.
And Emma, what are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, while it's going to take an ideological fight, it's going to take a military fight. I mean, everyone can see at this point that you have to fight this on every single front. But isn't the most powerful weapon you have to defeat this ideology the idea that this is a war against Muslims and Christians and Yazidis and every minority in the world? It's a war against everyone who is not like them. And it's a war about power and world domination. It's instead of running away from the idea of religion, don't you just have to confront who they are and what they are and what they want? They want to kill everyone who is not like them. And what are governments not doing, Emma? And what are we not doing in the fight strategically that we should be doing to confront this and deal with it?
ISIS's appeal is from its ability to endure and expand. And it has this base in Syria and Iraq. It is able to benefit from the chaos of the civil wars that are ongoing in Iraq and inside Syria. Inside Syria, 250,000 have been killed. The majority of those have actually been killed by the Syrian regime. So you've got an environment in which Assad, the president, is committing mass murder against his people. In that environment, he was willing to let out Islamist jihadis from jail because he wanted to undermine the opposition, which started off initially, it was young guys, it was secular, it was just wanted better government. So he plotted, if you like, to ensure that these Islamist jihadis took over the lead in the opposition. So you've got a very, very complicated situation. And it's almost that ISIS can't be defeated if the civil war isn't brought to an end. It's the civil war that creates the space for this chaos. It's a civil war which has brought in, you've got Iran and Russia on one hand supporting Assad. You've got Saudi and some of the Gulfies and Turkey supporting some of the armed groups. You've got a proxy war going on. You've got all these other aspects going on. As you said, the vast majority of people being killed are Muslim. But as long as, our efforts should be on helping to end the civil war inside Syria, that has to be a priority.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time. So briefly, there is some discussion about sending in ground troops. Should we send them? Should we not send them? This plays into Islamic State's propaganda. They want an apocalyptic war with the West. It is just propaganda. It's not actually what they want. What they want is to control the whole world. So why are we only talking about sending American boots or Western boots on the ground? Why aren't we talking about sending Muslim boots, a Muslim army? Because it's clear to me from my time in the region, and I pretty much bet that none of you would disagree, that it's going to take an entire world effort led by Muslims to win this fight. What about Muslim boots on the ground? Because the Iraqis can't do it alone, the Syrians can't do it alone, so there has to be something else.
Want me to go first?
Sure.
Just quick, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
ISIS has to be defeated militarily and ideologically, and it can only really be defeated by the Sunnis inside Iraq and inside Syria. And they're only going to turn against ISIS when they see it can't win, that there are better alternatives, and that they're being supported. And as yet, there hasn't been enough support from the West and from other countries to Sunni Arabs on the ground in Iraq inside Syria.
Farah?
So I would just say really briefly, connecting both of your questions, if we understand that the us and them narrative is the narrative that they are putting forward, and we understand that the strength is the diversity of Islam around the world, you want the diversity of Muslim majority nations to be able to be in this. So in my view, I completely agree with you. Where are those states? Why are they not doing more? Well, it's politics. It gets back down to politics. And I don't mean to be tight about that, but really, truly, it isn't just about Middle Eastern countries playing this game because it's happening in the Middle East. Ideology has no borders. You need to see the kind of coalition of Muslim majority states that are in this because they understand it's a global problem and a global threat, and that they're held accountable for not doing anything about that us and them narrative, even in their backyard, with how they treat the different kinds of Muslims in their particular communities.
I would totally agree, and then maybe add for the last 20 seconds, just in the meanwhile, I really think it's important that we begin to talk about the nature of the threat we have and how all of you as mothers and as mayors and as CEOs and as people who lead others need to engage in your own security. I don't mean to be gloom and doom. In fact, I find it empowering to embrace the fact that we will be at risk for some time, because I have great confidence in our government. I worked for it. We're not going to stop everything right now. And so we need to take the long-term approach, but we also need to empower ourselves Support first responders, as you know, talk to your employees, talk to your kids, because that's the only way that we're going to get out of this fear.
And tell them what? Tell them when you go to the movies, make sure you know where the
So
exits are.
age-appropriate,
Think about where you'll hide if someone opens fire.
But you know what? I think, yes. I mean, I think that the idea, most countries do this. I mean, I think that the idea that we think the sort of, my school's doing an active shooter case, my high school, my kids are 14, 12, and 10. My 14-year-old gets it, right? It's not like I'm deluding her in a world. She knows CNN stuff before I do because she gets that whatever it is on her, whatever her is. And so talk to the phones. If the phone service is down, honey, where are you going to go, right? In an active shooter case at a movie theater, don't listen to the politicians. Listen, I got one of you, I got one girl, you run. And then guess what? You run faster. That's what you do in an active shooter case if you can. Then you hunker down if you can. People have studied this for years. You know that that's the training. And so talk to them age appropriate. They're getting it. And you can either have them live in fear or us live in fear, or say, okay, there's tools that I can use. They're not going to be perfect. They are not ideal given the world we have, but what's our alternative? I mean, that's the other thing. What's our alternative? So.
Okay, so that was a cheery
I
way to
know.
start off your mornings.
I'm actually happy.
I could go on for hours. I know we have to keep moving. Tina will yell at me if I go much more over my time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very, very much for putting it in perspective for us. I hope it's been useful to you. And see you next year.
Thank you.